Yes, I know, a little bit different opening. Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to Ireland Bound. This, I love this picture because of its shape. This right here, this is my grandmother, Margaret Ethyl Wilson Garrett. This is Grandpa Luther. Um, I'm going to talk about them today. I'm saving him for the very last because, um, well, let's just say that I would rather not talk about him at the moment. So, and of course, I'll explain all that later. But that is one of very few pictures. Yes, the cats are already making their appearances. That is one of very few pictures that exist of my grandparents. And honestly, it's the only one that I've ever seen of both of them together. There's an older picture of Grandma Garrett that I have somewhere. Um, Basically, there have been so many things packed, repacked, unpacked, packed again that I'm not exactly sure where the picture is at. I know that there is, or at least there was one picture before this last move that I made several years ago to where I'm at now of Grandpa Garrett. Uh, Past that point, I don't know of any, well, very many other pictures. I've seen either one or two of Grandma online, but like I said, it's there's certain things I don't want to say about Grandpa right now, but I want to concentrate more on Grandma. Um, this is my father's parents that I'm talking about here today in this one. So I'm going to start. Uh, I had got a box of stuff from my sister in law, and a lot of stuff, a lot of relatives, and it's a little bit overwhelming kind of going through it because most of them are cousins. You know, that picture there and some paperwork that I have here are pretty much most of what I have found for my grandparents. So I'm going to start. Um, Top one was actually more. Well, actually, that one was about grandma. It says family records, and then of course it lists her parents. You know, people who are doing genealogy like I am. This information here is like finding gold. Of course, I knew that my grandparents' name. Um, you know, the name of her parents, which was Joe and Mary Wilson. Um, the It was like Joseph Elkane, if I remember right. Elkane's not a name that I've heard before, so it's kind of weird getting it into my head. But there's Joseph Elkane and then Mary Lewis Cook Wilson. Uh, why in the world? Well, this one almost looks like Lucy, but most of the records I have found online say Lewis. And considering that her mother was a Lewis, it kind of makes sense because, as I have discovered in all of the records I have gone through, not many people were very original. Of course, when you start having a lot of kids, uh, yeah, you start recycling names. You use a family name as someone's middle name, like Grandma Garrett did with my dad. Her maiden name was Wilson, and she named my dad Lloyd Wilson. And as I have discovered on my mother's side, her great grandmother Tafina had a grandmother named Tafina. And of course, myself, I'm a victim too. Uh, my middle name's Marie, and I was named after my mother's mother, who was Marie also. So, you know, I mean, sometimes you get original. You might have like one name that's original, and then you'll kind of add others to it. Um, it kind of depends from family to family. But one thing that I have noticed is that a lot of times family names, and in all honesty, doing genealogy research, there's a part of me that's glad for that, because I can look and I can go, oh, okay, now this kind of fits together. Now I understand, and it's like everything is more understandable, because of the fact you're going, okay, no, let's see, considering there was a grandchild with this name, or this is a family name and I've seen it used with other relatives further down, it puts it together. But anyways, yeah, so there was Joseph and Mary, and of course, Margaret Ethyl, which was grandma's name. She was their second child, but she was the oldest girl. And of course, here has listed her kids. Um, for whatever reason, on this, they did the boys first, even though, as I said in the last family video that I did, the girls, all three of them that lived, were actually born first. Of course, there was 4 girls born. One of them died in infancy. So they have it listed, of course, Uncle Darwin and my dad, and then following it, Aunt Gladys, Aunt Vera, and Aunt Enda. So at least they did do them oldest to youngest, just did the boys first. And of course, her sisters that were living at that time, and it looks like at the time of her death, there was only 3 sisters that were living, Leona, Aura, Verna, and Ida. Yes, I have aunts named Aura and Ida. So for people out there who like potato products, it's just a strange coincidence. Okay, don't make anything of it. No conspiracy theories, please. And of course, at the time she died, 13 grandchildren, which I am the youngest of her grandchildren. And then she had 29 great grandchildren and 8 great great grandchildren. So, sorry for all the moving around. I'm just not in a comfortable position tonight for whatever the reasons are. So, like I said, that is the living family that she had at the time of her death. Um, and of course, she was born January the 11th, 1894, in Limestone County, Texas. So, anybody watching from Limestone County at any point, uh, hey, we might have a little bit of a family connection. So it might be worth finding out there. It says she entered into rest, which I kind of like that terminology, that phrasing. That's a very nice way of putting it. She entered into rest September the 20th, 1978, in Fort Worth, Texas. Yeah, I was almost 4 years old at that point. That was just a couple of weeks basically before my 4th birthday. So I got to have her for almost 4 years. Says services, Everman Baptist Church, 10 a.m. Saturday, September the 23rd, which was 3 days later, 1978. For some reason back then, everybody was kind of a stickler to have funerals within 3 days. It didn't make any difference when you died. It's like there was always such a push that it was like 3 days, 3 days, 3 days. And the thought of a longer time never occurred to me until, well, about the time that my dad died. And I remember sitting there, it's like, I made the comment, I was just an 18-year-old kid, and I was sitting there with my mom and my brother and sister-in-law and one of my nieces, and I remember I made the comment, like, well, don't we have to bury him in 3 days? And someone said, oh no, with our embalming procedure, says it can be done at any time, and of course I wasn't familiar with stuff like that, and I didn't realize that back, you know, let's say 100 years ago, they didn't have embalming. So we kind of got people into the ground as fast as possible. So 2 to 3 days was kind of an average. It gave a chance for family to get there and to be able to have a proper service. Um, said officiating Reverend Everett R. Abrams, which I'm going to guess he was the pastor of the church. It would make sense. Um, and then, of course, where she was interned at. Since you can go online and find that information, I don't feel bad about reading it, especially with the fact that if any other family member sees this and they want to go visit her grave, she is in the Rendon Cemetery in Rendon, Texas. It's a nice little grave. That's where both of my parents are at, and a couple of my aunts, and at least one cousin that I know of that I can think of. I know I've seen another Garrett name out there. There was one year my mother and I went out there and we decided just to wander around the cemetery, and uh, I know I saw a Garrett name in another section of the cemetery. Now this is some of the fun stuff here. Um, this one is a short one, so I'm going to go ahead and read it. It says Recollections, Memories of Ethel Wilson Garrett. Uh, I discovered that sometime in the 70s or so, apparently the Everman school system, which was where uh, most of my Garrett family is from here locally, the Everman school system did a series of projects, school projects, where kids had to interview, a family member to get, family history, kind of a genealogy project. Because I have seen for some of my other relatives, you know, other stories, and almost all of them were very similar because it was like one of them was, I think it was talking to either Ida or Aura. I can't remember which one it was. I'm pretty sure it was one of those two sisters. And the recollections were almost exactly like what was done with Grandma. 1977. Uh, I'm not sure which relative it could have been because some of the box with some of the pictures in it, some of them have Uncle Darwin's name written on them, but it's written like at a later time because the ink is different than the older stuff, which is kind of fading. So some of the pictures go back into the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So I mean, they're pretty old pictures, but the Darwin signature looks newer and fresher than the older ones, saying, this needs given to Aunt. Most of them say Aunt Mary, so that would mean that it was like some of her relatives, giving the pictures to them. So like I said, there's a lot of pictures, and I'm going to guess that probably this was done in the 70s. That would have been possibly David's two kids, um, because that would put them about that age. Um, David would have already had kids by that point. So, like I said, it's Gary. Gary is one of my cousins, and Patricia was the other one. So, it could have been one of them. I don't know for certain because I don't know where it came from. But, anyways, this was Recollections, Memories of my grandma, Ethel Wilson Garrett. It says, in memory of my mother, Mary Cook Wilson, who taught us honor, honesty, and obedience to God. Okay, God used to be a very important part of a lot of people's life. And as I've discovered digging into records, apparently in my family past, it's a very important part of our lives too. It says Mary Cook Wilson was born March the 13th, 1874, near Old Aurora in Wise County, Texas. So, like I said, for someone who's doing genealogy, this is like a gold mine right here. Says her mother passed away when she was 5 years old. She had a brother named Robert who was 2 years younger than she, and a sister named Minerva, who died in infancy. Her father's name was John Cook. Her mother's maiden name was Mattie Lewis. Now, remember Mary Lewis Cook? So, this Mattie Lewis, you know, family name, like I said, seemed to be a very popular thing in throughout history, at least in my family. So Mattie Lewis, that is my, let's see, Mary was my great grandmother, so this would be my great great grandparents. Two solid names right here. Let's see, it says in 1910, our family was making a trip to Wichita Falls, and we stopped at Aurora to inquire about my mother's folks, the Lewis family. We found Frank Lewis, who was one of her uncles, living in a crude camp out in his pasture among his cattle. Things, in the late 18, early 1900, things were pretty primitive anyway. So, kind of makes me wonder how crude this camp was. Was it just like rocks on the ground with a fire in the middle? How crude was this camp? It says he was a very eccentric old fellow. I remember hearing him say there were three things he could not abide. They were a setting hen, a rocking chair, and a pacing horse. Yeah, okay, craziness runs in the family. Me, I love the horse. A horse can pace all he wants just as long as he's pacing in front of me. Uh, like I said, eccentric fellow. It says he had three children, Clem, Doug, and Luella. I do not know if any of them are still living. So this would have been like a great 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 uncle, great great uncle, something like that. So Luella, that's the name. Clem, Doug, and Luella. Says after my grandmother Cook died, grandfather married a widow whose name was Page. Okay, had to look there for a moment because this typing is pretty old too, so some of the letters are a little faded. Anyways, her name was Paige. I'm guessing that's her first name. You know, so she had several children. They all lived in the breaks of the Brazos River near Stephenville. All right, so I've got family that come from near Stephenville and now up around Aurora. So all over Texas here. We spread out pretty good, didn't we? Um, Mother often told us of the beautiful blue flowers that grew there. They were known as buffalo clover, but are now known as bluebonnets. Now, thing is for some reason my dad passed on my love of bluebonnets, and now I know why. Apparently, it was passed down through the family. It says the Texas state flower, which I can't remember when that was put as our state flower, but I remember my whole life. And in fact, Uncle Darwin had his whole front yard at one time covered in bluebonnets. It was such a beautiful sight. And we came at just the right time to where the seeds were popping out, and he allowed us to take a bunch of the seeds. I'm not sure what happened to the seeds. I don't know where they're at. But yeah, so they used to be known as buffalo clover. Says their drinking water was carried from a spring on the Brazos River. One of the children's chores was to carry water from the spring each morning before they started for school. Says one morning about sunup, as Mother was on her way to the spring for water, she glanced to one side, and there lay a panther on the riverbank watching her. Now, this is Grandma's mother, so I'm giving. There's not giving away a lot there. She's going to survive because she's around to have my grandmother. So anyway, she saw a panther sitting on the riverbank. It says she was very frightened but went very quietly and filled her bucket at the spring, and then walked very quietly past the panther until out of sight, then ran all the way home. In all truth of the matter, that was probably the best thing she could do, because if she took off running, the panther probably would have chased her. So, she kept her cool. She, let's see, she was probably by this time maybe 10, I'm going to guess. Because, she was, I think it said up there about 5 or 6 when her mother died. Yeah, 5 years old. She was 5 years old. And the chances are Grandpa might have waited a year or two. This could even be a year or two after that. So, she might be 7, 8, 9, maybe 10. Uh, so, anyways, it says another time she was on her way home with a bucket of water about daybreak. It says she was barefooted and felt something sting her ankle. She looked down and saw a snake crawling off through the grass. Her father said it was a ground rattler. She lay for many days with her foot badly swollen, but finally recovered. Wow. uh, Ground rattler, the only thing I can think is just a rattlesnake. You know, um, Calling it a ground rattler, who knows what he was thinking with that. So, anyway, says she finally recovered. Says, when mother was 15 years old, she went to live with her aunt uh, in San Antonio. After a short while there, she was taken down seriously sick and lay many weeks with curvature of the spine. Having the services of a good doctor, she recovered. So, being in San Antonio, where it was like, for back then considered a big city, now it's a big city. Uh, you know, Having a good doctor was probably a good thing. So, let's see, a curvature of the spine. Um, I'm trying to think. Uh, I'm trying to remember what they call that nowadays. I believe one of my aunts actually started suffering with it in her later years. And come to find out that, you know, kind of makes me wonder if something like that isn't a little bit hereditary. Because, this would have been Aunt Vera's great grandmother. Took me a moment there. I had to stop and think for a moment. Says when mother was 17, the family moved to Tarrant County, where she met and married Joe Wilson, March the 16th, 1890. Says to that union were born 10 children. They were Albert, born July the 6th, 1892, Ethel, born January 11th, 1894, John, born March 27th, 1896, Maud, born March the 2nd, 1898, Mary, born June 23rd, 1900, Leona, born September the 6th, 1902, Snyder, born September the 20th, 1904, Aura, born August the 2nd, 1907, and Verna, uh, born March 21st, 1909, Ida, born June 13th, 1911. So that's all the dates there in order. And like I said earlier, Grandma, who was Ethel, she was the second one born. It says Ethel married Luther Garrett September 24th, 1911. And then, of course, Albert married Carrie Berry. Yes, it says Carrie Berry. Carrie Berry, May the 17th, 1914. Maud married Henry Gowan, July the 10th, 1917. John married Jetty Williams, September the 10th, 1917. Now, I'm going to stop there for just a moment on this one. Let's see, Jetty Williams. Um, Jetty Williams had 2 boys that she brought into the marriage. One of those boys was a young fellow by the name of Dub. Um, I don't know if that was a nickname or his real name. I would have to ask to find out. And the person I'd go to is my sister-in-law because Doug Williams was her dad. Okay, so before anybody starts getting things going, wait a minute here. Uh, like I said, Dub was my great uncle's stepson. No blood ties, just marriage ties. So Jetty's two sons, um, basically, one of them had a daughter that married my brother. Believe me, I used to have fun telling people that. They'd kind of look at me and they go, "What?" Let's see. Where was I? Yes. Mary married Roy Crane in June of 1918. Uh, Leona married Ray Bowling December 24th, 1924. Snyder married Berta Williams July 9th, 1928. Um, two Williams. Did I get them mixed up? I might have. It might be that. It might be that. I think it's actually Snyder. It wasn't John. Okay, I got my people mixed up. Let's switch that around. It was Snyder who married Deb's mother, not John. Okay, because I think I remember seeing some pictures online, a picture of Snyder and his wife, so whose last name was Williams. So, uh, what one of them? I'm pretty sure it's Snyder, but it's one of them. Verna married Clarence Crawford November 3rd, 1928. Ada married Glenn Minshew December 30th, 1930. It says, and Joe Wilson passed away February 20th, 1934. It says, and then Mary passed away November 1st, 1938. So, basically, they both saw all their kids married before they died. That was not too long there. It's a little bit, but my dad actually has memories of Grandma Wilson living with them. She lived with them for a while when he was younger, and he absolutely adored her. He thought she was the greatest. And of course, that was done March 24th, 1977. Uh, like I said, there's another one here that also has some good history. So if you will bear with me, I will try and read through it a little bit faster. If I slow down, it's because of the fact I'm having trouble reading some of this. Okay, so that was a lot through the Cook family side. This one is through the Wilson family side. It says in 1814, J.T. Jim Wilson was born near St. Louis, Missouri. It says his mother died when he was 13 years old. A small boy, 13 years old, says he ran away from home at the age of 13 years. He lived with a friendly tribe of Indians for a while and learned many of their crafts and customs. His first marriage was a failure. He had one son, Taylor Wilson. His second marriage lasted 2 years with his little daughter, Sarah, was 1 year old. His wife died. Okay, so this is a second marriage. So the first marriage failed. He had a son. He had a second marriage with a daughter, having a daughter with that marriage, and the wife died. So he is divorced and then widowed. It says he served through the Civil War on the rebel side. With war over, he went to California seeking gold, but was unlucky. So he ventured pretty far out there before he came back. It says he then came to Kennedale in Tarrant County, Texas. He met and married Margaret Smith, a widow whose husband, Alan Smith, had been killed in the war. There were 4 Smith children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. S.S. Smith, Hiram Smith, Leroy Smith, and Sena Smith, the daughter. To Jim and Margaret's union, 7 children were born. Okay, 7. He had 2 of his own, 8, 9, and then she had 4, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13 kids between the two of them. Oh my word. That's a lot of kids. And of course, 4 of them technically he can't claim as blood, just the fact that he married their mom. So 7 children were born: Nancy Jane, Joe E., which of course is my grandpa, Joe L. Kane, James Weaver, Melinda, Dora, Missouri. Dora, Missouri. Let's see. Where did I say he was born in Missouri? And he named one of his daughters Dora, Missouri. And our Hollywood people nowadays, they think they're being original with naming their kids after certain places. I have a grandparent that did it back in the 1800s. So it's Marianne and Elizabeth. So that's all the kids. So let's see. Joe and James looked like the only 2 boys. All the rest of them were girls. And of course, he had a son by the first marriage. So, I mean, he had 3 sons altogether. And let's just say that James Weaver was known as Uncle Jim in the family. And if I did a whole video of just him and the stories off of him, it would be like a 3-hour video. It would be a long video. There was a lot of stories around Uncle Jim. It says Jim and Margaret worked very hard. That's Jim Wilson, the great grandfather, I believe. So Jim and Margaret worked very hard and acquired 300 acres of land. At that time, Fort Worth was just a fort. It says Margaret had a 1-horse wagon. Once a week, she gathered up such vegetables and fruit as were in season, and along with butter, milk, and eggs, they took them to the fort and sold them. So they were making a pretty good living because they would go up to the fort and it's like, oh, hey, Miss Wilson, how are you doing? Come on in, bring in some of your great vegetables. It's like our guys could use them. So, she probably made some good money there supplying the fort. So my family really has some connections with Fort Worth. uh, Says late one evening on her way home, she saw a man laying by the roadside very sick. She put him in the back of the wagon and brought him home. She nursed him back to health, and then he went on his way wherever he was started to. Doctors were very scarce at that time, so Aunt Margaret, as she was called, filled in when they could not get a doctor. She bought drugs in bulk and made her own pills. Okay, considering how I feel about a lot of modern medicines and the fact that they don't work very well on me, and finding out that I have a grandma who is a doctor slash pharmacist, I find that very, very, very funny. It says, and she knew what herbs, barks, and roots had medical value. So, see, even though she bought things in bulk, made her own pills, she still understood the herbal value of natural remedies, too. It says her son Jim, that was Uncle Jim, had what was called white swelling in his right leg. He was seriously ill. She called in the only doctor in the community, a Dr. Hall. When he looked at the patient, he told her he would call another doctor, and they held a consultation. We know about consultations nowadays, don't we? Says he told Margaret that they decided to take the leg off at the knee. Take the leg off at the knee. What's Grandma Margaret going to do? Says Margaret told him if that was all they could do, to just go home and she would treat him. She went out and gathered a bunch of ragweeds and cut them into very fine, or cut them very fine, then cooked them until they were pliable. She then thickened the mixture with cornmeal and made a poultice. Finally, the bone burst. She Yeah, wow, apparently it was a bone problem. She continued the poultice treatment until it drew slivers of bone out one at a time. He finally recovered, but always walked with a limp. Okay, so anybody out there with any kind of medical knowledge that can explain this to me, that the bone burst, but yet he's still able to walk, please do, because I'm curious. Let's see, just see, what was it they called it? Let me go back to the previous page. White swelling. That's what they called it, white swelling. And she said something about the bone bursting. Like I said, if the bone burst, he should not have been able to walk because, I mean, of course, I know this was like really, real long time ago, and they didn't understand such things and have the knowledge we do now. So, like I said, if someone has a better explanation, I really want to hear it. So that's one of the things for the comment down below. You can, if you have a little medical knowledge or maybe you know something about that, let me know. I want to know what it really was because I know the bone didn't burst. Let's see. It says but he walked with a limp. She treated typhoid fever, pneumonia, and numerous other sicknesses. One neighbor who lived several miles away was taken down with what was called slow fever. It says they came after Aunt Margaret. She carried her little satchel of medicine and fixed him some medicine and left directions for taking it. A few days later, his brother came after Aunt Margaret. He said Jim was awful sick. She got on her little black pony and went with him. When she arrived, she asked if he had taken the medicine. He said no, it tasted bad. She gave him a slap on the face. She gave him a slap on the face. I love that. Told him she would be back in a day or two, and if he had not taken the medicine, it would get he would get worse treatment the next time. Oh my word! I love her. I absolutely love her. He took the medicine and finally recovered. She acted as a midwife in the whole community. Now, you remember I had talked about Tafina back, oh my word, it feels like ages ago. Um, I want to say it was back in November, the one that I did of hers. Uh, I mentioned the fact that she had acted as a midwife. So see, it wasn't only where she was at. There's a lot of other people too that they used midwives because, as I said in here, doctors were scarce. It says at that time there was not much law, and cattle and horse thieves were numerous. The citizens formed a committee and took care of thieves themselves when they could catch them. The first one they caught, they hanged on Mingus Mount, 1 mile north of Kennedale. At another time, they gathered and stationed the men on the road they thought the thief would take. All were stationed at their posts except one young man who was late. When they heard a horse coming very fast, they thought it was the thief. When he passed, the first man called out, "Who goes there?" The young fellow was afraid, and he thought it was the thief, so he did not answer. They shot him off his horse, and when they recovered the body, they saw it was the young man who was late for the gathering. And to this day, no grass grows where his blood was spilled. Now, for people who like a little bit of suspense or a horror story, there's your nice little one. That one was kind of interesting. Um, there's this is the third of 4 pages. The last page is only a half page, so we're almost there. It says SS and Leroy Smith operated a general merchandise store at Kennedale for many years. The Wilson children lived on land they had inherited. On March the 16th, 1890, Joe married Mary Cook. Their first son, Albert, was born July 6th, 1892. Ethel was born January 11th, 1894. John was born March 27th, 1896. A lot of this, I'm going to skip down to the end there because we've already discussed that on the other one. So, it says both Joe and Mary like to travel. Oh, this one's good. This one's good. I remember seeing this on another page. Someone had retyped it and just put in this little bit of story. This is good. It says both Joe and Mary like to travel. In 1896, they loaded their three oldest children into a covered wagon and made a trip to what is now called Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Okay, so of course the first ones would have been Albert, Ethel, and John. So John would have been like a little baby because he was born March 27th. So most likely they probably did this in warm weather, which would mean like late spring, summertime. So he's like a baby at this point. Anyways, they go to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Now, Fort Sill is famous for something, and it's something that involves a story that I did. A story that I did back, I want to say December, no, late November, December. Uh, they went to see relatives. Of course, at that time, there were no bridges across the Red River on the border of Oklahoma and Texas. The team of mules had never seen a ferry boat. Says it looked like the Wilson family would be drowned before they got the team and wagon on the ferry boat, and they arrived to the other to make, but they did survive to make other trips. One trip was to deep East Texas. It was a place full of malaria. Shortly after arriving, the children came down with chills and fever, so the trip was cut short. They made several trips to Wichita Falls, Texas to visit Mary's father and family. This trip took 4 days of steady travel. So that's to Wichita Falls to get 4 days. So Fort Sill was probably like a little more than a week to get there. Because Wichita Falls is right there at the border, and Fort Sill, driving it is like 2 hours further in. So, I mean, that's let's just say that an hour of our driving would be a day of driving for them. So, we're looking about a week's time for them to travel. Now, let's see. There was no highway on graded roads. The meals were cooked over campfires. The bread was baked in Dutch ovens. Frying pans were used for meat and potatoes and anything else they had. When night found them, they made camp for the night with the mother and smaller children sleeping in the wagon, father and the older children under the wagon on a pallet. The mules were tied to the back wagon wheels. In the early morning hours, they were awakened by bands of howling wolves, and the children were so scared there was no more sleep for them. Yeah, I know. I wouldn't have been able to have slept either. Uh, I know I wouldn't have. It says Joe bought out some of the heirs until. Okay, Joe bought out some of the heirs until he had 100 acres of land. He built his home, and he and Mary lived there until their deaths. Joe passed away January 26, 1834, and Mary passed away November 1st, 1939. It says, I, Ethel Wilson, was married to Luther Garrett September 24th, 1911. To our union was born 7 children. She only listed, she listed all of them that were born. It says Gladys, July 17th, 1912. Vera, June the 18th, 1914. Ida, or excuse me, not Ida, Enda. I mispronounced that, my bad. It says Enda is April 3rd, 1916. Vivian, November 21st, 1917. She's the one that died in infancy. So she didn't live very long. She says she only lived 2 weeks, so she didn't even live hardly into December. I mean, 2 weeks is not very long. Darwin, December 26, 1918. Lloyd, April the 25th, 1921. says, in Fred, who was born July 17th, 1923, he lived only 10 days. So, yeah, both the kids were like 2 weeks that they had them, only 2 weeks. Says, I am now age 78. My husband, Luther Garrett, is aged 87. 78, 87. I love that right there. Says, we have 12 living grandchildren. So this is before I was born. This was done before I was born, because remember the one where she died, she had 13, and this one says 12. So this is like the early 70s on this one. So this was an earlier copy. Says, see, 12 living grandchildren, 23 great grandchildren, and 2 great great grandchildren. Says this year of 1972. So that was approximately 2 years before I was born. So, anyways, that's just a couple of little family histories, a couple of little stories there. Um, Grandma Garrett was greatly loved by her family. Um, my dad always called her such a great Christian woman. But the question came, how could she marry my grandfather? Um, I know I'm kind of ending this on a bad note, but Grandpa Luther was not a good man. My dad said that in his years growing up, says his father never whooped him. Says he either beat him with his fist or he kicked him with his boots. Um, he he was not a good man. He decided to go off with some of his son-in-laws on a fishing trip and was going to leave my grandmother with one of her daughters, my Aunt Vera, very, very much pregnant. And he was going to take like 2 of the cars, and between him and the other guys that he was going with, and they were going to leave one of the cars behind, but he was going to disable it so that they couldn't leave, because he was afraid that his wife was going to go off and cheat on him. And so he disabled the car, and when my aunt, who was, like I said, Dad always said she was about 9.5 months pregnant. She was very much pregnant with her first child. She was begging him, Daddy, please, says, I might go into labor and we might have to get some help. Don't disable the car and leave it so that way we can get help. He backhanded her. He backhanded her so hard it threw her across the bed in the bedroom where they were at. Like I said, he was not a good man. My dad said he could remember seeing him taking little girls that would walk down the road while he was plowing the field and setting them up on the plow handles. Now, remember that this is like one of those that you have to walk behind. It's not like a plow nowadays where you get in a tractor and you drive off. This was pulled by horses or mules. And he said he would sit there watching the distance, his father basically sexually molesting these little girls. It's a hard thing to admit, that you have a grandfather that is like this. But this is going to be the only time that I really mention him. And like I said, sometimes the hard parts are the ones that you got to mention, because my dad somehow managed to overcome that and became a much better man than his father. The last one I'm going to tell, my father had told me several times, and my brother, about the time my mother passed away, my brother reconfirmed this story. Both of them had said the same thing. My brother was going over to see Margaret Ethyl. He walked into the house and heard something, and when he walked back to the kitchen, Luther had Grandma pushed in between the icebox and a counter and was beating her. I mean, she's like a 70-something-year-old woman. and he's beating her, screaming, "I'm going to beat the devil out of you." He pulled Grandpa off of her, and he was like a raving lunatic. He was threatening to take my brother apart, and my brother was not going to have any of it because my brother had a good 5 inches on him and was probably twice his weight. And he told him, he says, "Oh man," he says, "you either sit down in that chair or you'll be laying on the floor." Um, like I said, my dad had told me that story for years, and for whatever reason, when when my mother died, my brother decided to tell me that story out his own mouth, and it lined up exactly with what my dad said. Uh, like I said, it's hard to admit that you had someone like that, especially someone that was that close of a relative, just a grandfather. Um, my dad would tell you that the only reason that he didn't turn out like his father was because of his mother. I mean, she was a sweet and wonderful woman, and I don't think anyone ever had a bad word for her. She put up with more than she should have. She really did. She dealt with more from him than she should have had to deal with, but she did because at the time her options were almost zero. So, anyways, like I said, I almost hate to leave it on such a bad note, but that was Grandpa. That was Grandpa. And Grandma was a wonderful person, and she deserved better. So, anyways, like I said, I'm sorry to leave it so heavy like this, but I didn't want to start off talking about him and then try to make it lighter and make it, better. So I decided to save it for the end. But anyways, that's all for this one, and I'll talk to y'all later.